I'm delighted that I'm able to talk this morning with an old friend, Mark Vernon, who I think is one of the great minds of our current period, a very important voice to be heard. And he's just published a book on Blake called Awake. And I do often feel that we need to wake up. So I haven't yet read the book. It's only been out for a few days, but I look forward to doing so. And I thought a good place to begin, there's so many things that we both think are important and share in common, but I thought a place to begin might be with imagination, because I think this is absolutely at the core, isn't it? And imagination is one of those things that needs a bit of commentary, because a lot of people nowadays really need to be introduced to an idea of imagination which is different from the one they quite possibly hold. And I thought a good place to start would be with that quote, to the eyes of the man of imagination, nature is imagination itself.
Yeah, look thanks very much for finding the time to talk, Iain, and your wonderful work is very much in my mind, in many ways, actually, of course, but not least when talking about William Blake. You quote Blake quite often, not least to the eyes of the man of imagination, nature is imagination himself. And you call him one of the least cozy of poets, but one of the most insightful who ever lived, I think. And
yes,
turn to him regularly to kind of capture the spirit of something as well as the analysis. And I think the two come together actually in Blake really wonderfully, not least when it comes to the imagination. So yeah, I agree. Let's get going on that. I mean,
yes.
what the heart of it for me is to say that you or I don't have imagination, but the imagination has us. And I feel that there's something in that kind of reversal that's really important. And actually, it's not least of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, because you very often read books about Blake now, and he's kind of admired for his imagination. It's said that we need something of his imagination in our times, but the imagination that's being contemplated there is almost like a private possession that perhaps we all have in some small part, but a figure like Blake has in large part. And we need somehow to sort of use that to beam out across an otherwise dark, dreary cosmos to, with luck, kind of light it up a bit, And I think this is completely to misunderstand what Blake thought of the imagination. He, I think, knew himself to be in a great flow of imagination and invited to collaborate, co-create, with this great active,
absolutely,
creative, lively, energetic, all these words that he loves, presence. And so that's one of the fundamental things that I want to try and get across, actually, is that if we can feel that the imagination, nature is imagination itself, when we look out into the world, when we look inside, when we look into the inside of the whole world as well, that we were seeing the manifestation of, for Blake, the divine imagination, and it's calling us and inviting us to participate with it.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful idea, and it's very, very important that, as it were, it's not something we generate, but it is something that speaks in and through us and pre-exists us. And we can either choose to open ourselves to it in a way that Blake, more than anybody I can think of, did, or to close one's being to imagination. And it reminds me of I'm always harking back to something that Mary Midgley said about how is it that we have this idea of the cosmos as somehow a bleak and oppositional place. We come out, we are ourselves creations of that cosmos. And I want to say, if the universe is just mere bits of matter meaning nothing and bumping into one another randomly, it's rather extraordinary that they produced the poems of Blake. I think the answer is there's more there than meets this eye.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, another twist on this that I try and get to is that I think Blake would also say that the modern world, in its wariness of the imagination, i.e., thinking it's somehow fantastical, or even denial of the the presence of the imagination in which we live, as you say, and invited to, from which we spring. That in itself is an imaginative undertaking, partly because of the comments that Mary Midgley makes. It requires a bizarre and extraordinary miracle that colliding inner matter would produce the poems of Blake. So there's but what's happening is it's like a closing down of the breadth of the imagination, so that all its capacity is focused in this single vision and Newton sleep, as he also famously puts it. That image where Newton, subterranean Newton, looking at the parchment with the arc and the triangle and so on it, and the pair of compasses, and that is a kind of intensified imagination, but it's one that's closing off the wider world. And I think that this is how he, I think, explains the remarkable change in the modern world, that he saw coming 200 years ago, that has now, so become present 200 years later, post-industrial revolution, the scientific mindset in its reductive forms anyway, very much shaping who we think we are and so on now. But that, and I think for me, it sort of helps to think of that as an imaginative undertaking, but one that has closed down and closed off, because then I think you can sort of go into the world as it is and try and see how it opens up again, rather than situating yourself too much in some sort of opposition. And so you get into a sort of, fight. No, it's more like there's tremendous momentum imaginative in the modern world, I think, but it misunderstands itself. It's got misdirected. So that kind of way in is one of the things which I'm trying to do in the book.
Yes, it's fettered or hobbled in our modern world, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because Blake very often seems to be opposing something, and another time welcoming it. And I think that's because he sees different aspects to it. So there are aspects of what Newton saw that he thought were imaginatively liberating. But there was also something about that mindset that he could see was quite the opposite, was fettering the mind. So you find him, or some people would say they find him a bit contradictory, but he's not really being contradictory. He's welcoming the what I would say the right hemisphere vision of something, but opposing himself to the left hemisphere interpretation of it. I don't wish to draw things back to the hemispheres, but it does seem to me to make a great deal of sense. And perhaps the very word imagination is one of those words, because, and perhaps you'd like to talk about that, but it's, equated in the modern mind often with fantasy. But in fact, it was the very opposite of fantasy. Fantasy is the thing that takes you away from reality. Imagination was your only chance of getting into the depth of reality. What do you think?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, this relates to the accusation that was made to Blake in his time, and in more diagnostic terms, it's still made now by people that work in mental health, which you know about, I know about. You as a psychiatrist, me as a psychotherapist. But it is to misunderstand, I think, where Blake is situated. So yeah, perhaps you're alluding to the near contemporary of Blake, Coleridge, who makes this distinction between fantasy and imagination. And fantasy is that which might be a little amusing. It might kind of brighten up the day, but it doesn't go anywhere. Basically, it just sort of falls in on itself and it passes. It may actually lead you astray as well. Whereas imagination connects with reality, and therefore brings reality to you and amplifies it. I mean, the great example of this for me is Albert Einstein, who had these wonderful imaginative forays into traveling on a light beam. And he said, it's sort of child's play in one way, but the point is that it leads to special relativity. Which then, hundreds of other people can join in that imaginative field. And I just think you see that with Blake. If Blake had been crazy, it might have been very florid, but it wouldn't have drawn people now by the millions, because they wouldn't sense that there was something of life in Blake, that they wanted to relate to imaginatively know within themselves as well. And so nothing in the book which I sort of really very much resist is this temptation to diagnose Blake as hyper-fantastic or aphantastic, or certainly the temporal lobe epilepsy, migraine, whatever. There's a bit of a micro industry in Blake studies trying to work out which one it is. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why I think that's on hiding to nothing, but what it's really trying to do is keep your worldview steadily in place, rather than allowing Blake and the imagination, that speaks through him to expand your world, to awake.
Well, and I think, and you think, that this is very important for our times, for our current state in the modern world. And I know that there needs to be no other reason to write a book about Blake than to allow Blake again to speak to people. But would you like to comment further on why you think that it's important for all of us now to listen to what Blake has to offer?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I actually, another book which was on my mind when I was beginning to put together this was one by Eugene MacArthur, called The Misenchantments of Mammon. I very much was struck by this notion of misenchantment. So it's a kind of variant on the Weber thesis that we live in a disenchanted world. And this book argues that particularly money, which very interestingly shares a lot of words with spiritual traditions, like wealth, like value, like riches, but the spread of the presence of money in our lives, which actually was, just getting going, the cash economy in Blake's time, new forms of borrowing and debt, and so on. He argues that this has led to us not to live in a disenchanted world, but one that's become misenchanted. So again, we kind of it uncouples us from reality in enchantments of our own making. I mean, I feel I see this even walking around, London. There's a mix of sort of enchantment and misenchantment, and you sense it when you walk in one place. And I use the word sort of place advisedly, because for me, a place has a spirit of its own, a soul, a presence that invites your soul and presence to commune with it. And so, it lifts you.
Absolutely.
It's a good place to be. Whereas London is also now overlaid with pure spaces. They're these great buildings, which are sort of impressive in a way, because they're big, and the scale slightly daunts you. But it's a misenchantment, that kind of architecture. And of course, it's mostly there for reasons of utility, and it looks like it sprang up yesterday and will collapse tomorrow. So it thins your sense of life.
That's extraordinarily
one way,
rich.
in which I feel the architecture of our times. If we can do the sort of spiritual analysis of it, if you like, and Blake can help with this, then that's just one way, because the environment matters so much, in terms of what we perceive or don't perceive.
Absolutely, and I wonder if you know the work of the Finnish architect Juhani Pallasmaa on this. He's very interesting on how we're repelled by the surfaces of buildings these days. And we, more than that, I believe we slip around on the surface of reality without sort of sinking into it. It's no longer porous. It's no longer something in which we're embedded. And your distinction between a space and a place seems to me to put its finger on that one, that we no longer have a place where we belong. And that's partly to do with what's happened to society, partly to do with what we think about nature, and partly to do with the desacralizing of the cosmos. And so your idea of, well, it's not necessarily your idea, but the idea that you raise of misenchantment reminds me of Chesterton's point that when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And so the risk is that people become enchanted because they wish to be enchanted by something. But because the sources of enchantment are now so constricted by the culture, they begin to worship in a way and be seduced by things that are leading them in the wrong direction and leading them by false values. What do you think?
No, for sure. I mean, and this relates to another thing that I try and bring out in Blake, which is his understanding of desire. And because, you only have to read Blake in a cursory way to realize that he celebrates desire. Love, 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 free as the mountain wind, or the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, and exuberance is beauty, and so on. But I think what he understood is that desire can lead us astray unless we understand and work with our desire to lead it to that which will actually satisfy, which is related to your comment about the sacred. And there's a section in one of his early pamphlets that I think kind of captures this, where he talks about really consumerism, and the consumerist lie, but it's deeply spiritually aware, is that by possessing more and more of things, and we might find satisfaction. But what Blake says is nothing less than all will satisfy man. The full quote is more is the cry of a mistaken soul. Nothing less than all will satisfy man. And I very much like the second bit, because he's not saying, okay, we all get that consumerism's run out of control, we're consuming the planet, we need to curb our desires. For Blake, that would be a disaster, because you would be curbing your imagination, you'd be curbing your capacity to enjoy the sacred cosmos, the things that are infinite. But what you've got to understand is that possession is not the way to do that. It's the cry of a mistaken soul. And the invitation is, what might it mean that nothing less than all can satisfy us? And I think this then relates to what we're talking about, the imagination as well, that we're invited by Blake to give all that we have to the all that is. And as he puts it in the beautiful quatrain, kiss the joy as it flies. To try and hold on to
lives in eternal sunrise. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
That's
go on.
Yeah, no, sorry. So I think apropos why he matters now. There's a very natural tendency to think that we've got to sort of sit on our humanity a bit, but I think Blake would say no. We've just got to understand our humanity better and how it can reach for the all. So this is, certainly in a way, it's an educative program.
It is indeed. And I think that's a very good point you've made, that it's not about turning one's back on something that is positive in its own right, but in directing it aright and not associating it with grasp, with catching, with holding, with having for yourself, but instead to fully enjoy it as it is living, and that you kill it by grasping it. And so that's a very important point, because I think that what I love about Blake is he doesn't say that in order to understand the eternal, we should turn our backs on the temporal. To understand the infinite, we should turn our backs on the finite, but we should discover them through the temporal and the finite. And that's an insight that he shares with Goethe, which is always a good thing in my book. But it is a really important one because it says exactly what you're getting at, that this is not about turning away from the things of this world, but treating them in the right way so that you can see through them the infinite potential that is glowing there in them all the time. And when you said, desire, yes, I was thinking of the different meanings of the word eros in Greek, eros, that it can be confined to something that is approximated to lust if it's misunderstood. But in fact, what he's talking about is something that is so beautiful and spiritual. When I say when Plato is talking of eros, he's not thinking merely of, as it were, sex, but he's thinking of what one can find through the things that are available to us as portals to another world, which is astonishingly beautiful and rich.
Yeah, the senses in Blake are these kind of thresholds, these portals, and we, in a way, step through the threshold, across the threshold by following this desire. But it's forming.
Yes.
We've got to form ourselves too, because as you say, the tendency to grasp, perhaps always remains with us, but the letting go in order to let in is very much part of the dance of life. But he's also, I think, you remind me of another very famous phrase of his: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. And I feel this is another way of him summarizing a very sharp critique of the emerging psychology of his times that's become ours, which treats the senses as if they're doors. This is related to what we were saying about imagination, that we feel as if I belong in my skull, you belong in your skull. And if we're lucky, we can sort of project out a bit. Maybe we can connect, and maybe we can enjoy a little bit of the world around us. But this was an idea that was emerging in Blake's time. Figures like David Hume and Adam Smith, and particularly John Locke, of course. They're developing this philosophy, and it's still completely dominant. I know it's one of in psychology, it's one of the areas that you are continually trying to re-understand. But most neuroscience still treats the brain as if it somehow is the place of the felt, comprehending, a lively senses. And Blake says no, that whole philosophy has to be cleansed. I think this is what he means by the doors of perception. I don't think he's really talking about some sort of ecstatic glimpse, actually, which for him just wouldn't really work, because it would just make it and turn this experience into another sort of possessiveness. You just sort of got to wait for the next glimpse or the next high. What he's saying is something much more fundamental, actually, that whole idea that somehow we're not part of that from which we're born, but somehow are these strange, isolated, alienated, lost creatures that have a kind of consolation in our senses. He says, no, that whole thing's got to go. And then when it does, you begin to see the infinite presence in the minute particulars. Precisely, that's absolutely fundamental to him as well.
Yes. And it's the neuroscience, the very reductive kind of neuroscience that envisages, not all neuroscientists are like this, but you have to admit the mainstream projects an idea that all this stuff is sort of caged inside our head. And indeed, we don't really see anything except our own projections on the blank walls of our miserable windowless cell. And this is a very, very odd, almost psychotic way to conceive of human experience. And I'm sure you know this, but Max Scheler, amongst other people, had this idea, the early 20th century German phenomenological philosopher, had this idea that which is really not such a stretch, that our thoughts and our feelings are not necessarily in us, but we are in them. I mean, a point of view I would definitely hold, and I imagine you might too. And so that when we're sharing thoughts, when we're sharing feelings, it's not like something sort of boings into me and something happens, and then it's that actually our thoughts and feelings really meet or merge.
Yeah, no, I agree. And actually, I think it's I wonder whether it's one of the reasons why dialogues and podcasts and so on are so appealing. It's partly obviously um, because of the people speaking. Let's not deny that. But I think it's more important is because what you get is a sense that um, the interlocutors are trying to reach for something that they're trying to tune to find the right words, and really the meanings are merging in between us now, and the hope is that listeners too
Absolutely.
feel that presence that's in between
Mm,
us all, in
mm,
fact. And so, the
mm.
joy of a really good conversation and dialogue is that sense of the field from which the participants are well with which the participants are collaborating, but are trying to draw on in the connections being made. We speak, as you're absolutely right, sort of from the outside in, really, not from the inside out.
Inside out, yes, yes, yes. Well, I think that, I mean, to get a little bit metaphysical for a moment, that actually all that we experience is relational. It comes out of a relation of whatever it is that in me can experience with whatever is out there, which is pregnant with potential experience. And that it's out of this coming together that everything we know arises. And I think that's a sense that Blake also had, that we discovered the joy in things. We don't put things there. Instead, we respond to something real and bring about its enrichment, so that in the dialogue between us and experience, or between two people who are exploring the same sort of area, something comes into being between them, which is a new element in experience, a new element in reality to be taken, to be made aware of. I'm probably not communicating that very well at all.
No, it's one of the things. Actually, I mean, it's one of the things which I grapple with a bit in the book. And so let me put this to you and see how
Hmm.
it does connect, because you've written a lot about this. And um, let me start with one of Blake's more sort of challenging comments, and this is one I wrestled with, where he remarks that pity divides the soul. Pity divides the soul. And I wonder what he
Hmm.
might mean by this for quite a long time, partly because, of course, he also celebrates pity. And pity, it
Hmm.
doesn't have
Hmm.
quite the ring of pitying someone in this sort of slightly demeaning way
Hmm.
that it does now. It was really another word for sympathy, for sort of
Hmm.
sharing in
Exactly.
the feeling
Yes. Hmm.
with someone. But why would he say it divides the soul? And I think that is because he was onto this sense that sympathy was being repurposed in his time, and rather than sympathy being that which we attune to, because we're sympathetic with the wider world. It might be the natural world, it might be the tree, it might be the skies and the stars and so on. All these words like influence and desire, all astrological terms originally, with the
True.
stars and from the stars, and
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
a
Exactly.
lot of religion and so on was about in the small rituals and the patterns and the myths of the day, navigating a way through this great flow of sympathy. But what was happening was that sympathy was being sort of drawn in as if it's something that you and I produce. And after Blake, you get a whole slew of words. Actually, one of the things which I look at in the book carefully is the
Mm-hmm.
emergence of new words, because I think they're so telling in terms of how our
Yes.
consciousness is shifting. And after Blake, you get these words like empathy and solidarity. And these are mostly associated actually with Auguste Comte, the positivist, who realized
Mm.
that the move to the kind of rational worldview, which he celebrated, might be deleterious to our humanity. So we needed new ways of framing our connection. But what it does, I think, is it uncouples us from this ground, to get back to your point.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so stressing the sacred sort of potential ground from which all this comes. So there is you and me, as it were, but there's the presence as well, that we're both implicitly or even explicitly trying to relate to. So the sacred, I think, really does matter, actually, because unless we have a sense that that is holding us, giving itself to us, is when we speak, we're almost speaking words of praise for this wider world. it's a word. Good feeling is not enough, and we know that now. I mean, I think that's become very clear. Empathy, for example, won't save us because it divides as much as it unites. Because it's very easy to empathise, with your friend in their loathing of the mutual enemy, for example. Empathy, I think, lies behind a lot of tribalism, and the mistake, I think, is to just rely on the human capacity alone, without opening up to, I would say the divine source, for all these things that our sympathy and so on can lead us back to. So I think that's why he says pity divides the soul. If soul is the animating presence in all things, it can fragment it if we rely solely on our feeling. But if that feeling itself is a kind of portal to a deeper awareness or presence, maybe it's felt intuitively, maybe it's felt as a kind of inflow of inspiration. I think we need to recover that, and that I'm going on a bit about that now. But I wonder that sort of third thing really matters actually to me in the book when understanding this relationality.
Very, very interesting, Mark. And I didn't know that I'd never come across pity divides the soul. Where does that come from? Do you remember?
I think it's the marriage of heaven and hell.
Okay, I must go back to it. But
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's
in
one
any
like
case,
you were saying earlier. It's one of these comments where he can say seemingly contradictory things, but what he's doing,
yes,
as you were saying as well, is because these things are alive and dynamic. In one moment you need one insight, but in the next moment you need another. So that's why he does it.
Absolutely. And this again makes enormous sense to me in terms of hemisphere differences, because it depends on whether you start, as the right hemisphere does, from the connected whole that we experience and only later break down, or start, as the left hemisphere does, from isolated elements of experience. And then the emphasis is on how do we put these together. Now, if they've never been fully separated or divided, then you don't need to find a way of putting them together. And by trying to put them together consciously, you're already on the wrong foot. You're already, as Comte realized, you destroyed something important, which was that foundational connectedness. Now, I believe that foundational connectedness is close to the idea of a cosmos that makes sense as a whole, that is unified and underwrites the values in which we inhere with one another in our shared experience. We live in a world where everybody starts from the idea that we're all separate little bubbles. I'm here, you're there. How do we commune? And your comment on threeness is very interesting there, because you can either think of this third element as something that grounds the other two, which is what I'm really suggesting that sacredness does, or you can think of that thirdness as some way of trying to rescue the separation by bringing them back together again in another entity. But maybe that's enough for now. But I was going to go on and talk about the Trinity, but I don't think Blake would have had much time for us if we did so.
Well, see, this is another theme of my book actually. I think Blake actually was very orthodox, actually with an uppercase
Right.
O as well as a lowercase o, because I think there's very good evidence that he knew of orthodox traditions, and knew therefore even of the great early writers in the Christian tradition on these things. I mean, one piece of evidence, if you like, for that is this book, where he talks about more and nothing less than all will satisfy us. It ends with this great declaration, therefore God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. And that is a standard, almost formulaic summary of the notion of the incarnation in Christianity that it rings throughout the church fathers.
And it's leading to theosis.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Divination, theosis, and so on. So I think that Trinitarian thought is implicit and on occasion does come to the surface in Blake. But maybe another way, rather than getting sort of too theological, although I quite like doing that myself, but nonetheless, but to keep it sort of the sense of the practical. Because when you were talking as well, it reminds me of another great theme in Blake, which resonates hugely with your work, which is this word contraries. opposites and contraries and so on. And you actually, one of the observations that you make that I hadn't realized is that Blake's famous image of Jacob's ladder, with Jacob asleep on the ground, and then the staircase with the figures ascending and descending, reaching into the heavens. You make the point that Blake's the only person to draw this as a spiral, or at least the only time you'd seen that as a spiral. And I hadn't thought about that before.
Yes.
But it speaks wonderfully to this dynamic point, I think, that if you perceive a reality as abundant, this potential is there always to give, rather than scarce, which I think is the distinction you were just drawing then, i.e., we must sort of possess and hold and protect and defend and so on. Then these contraries, these opposites, become the sort of the poles, like the poles of a magnet, that generate the field of abundance, and navigating your way through this field in these spiral ways then becomes appealing, and you might trust it and have faith in it and so on. So that's another way in which I feel that Blake addresses our time, because I think we do live in a sense that reality is scarce somehow, when the flip is no, there's an abundance there.
Yes, but more than that, we live in a reality where we believe it's linear. And therefore, the further you go from something that you don't like, the better. But what I'm pointing to is that if you carry on doing that, eventually you reach the very thing that you're trying to get away from, because we need to accept that a thing and its opposite exist in relation to one another. And you can never have one without something of the other. The dark side, this is something we don't see in modern discourse. We just think X is good, therefore let's just push and push and push for more of it, without realizing that Y is there anyway, and that you will, if you keep going in this direction, you will meet yourself. But what I want to, the reason I think that spiral is so important is that it is the only shape that brings two things together. The fact of an open-ended process and the idea of contraries. So Blake said, without contraries, there is no progression, I think, something like that. And that is absolutely right. It's this idea that I see in Heraclitus of the tautness of a bowstring or the tautness of a lyre string. And without the tautness of pulling in opposite directions, there is no power to produce a note or power to let fly the arrow. But in the spiral, sometimes you get this idea that things are circular. And I think that T.S. Eliot gives this famous expression to the idea that, as it were, we come back to the place we started from and know it for the first time. But I think what is a better idea is the idea that we go round on a spiral and we don't come back to where we started from. We're higher up than we were, but we come back to the place that is over the other place, and now we see what it was we thought then. So we're making progress. And what I quite like is that if you look down the axis of a spiral, you see a circular process. If you look along the spiral, you see a waveform, and you see the particle and you see the wave, and they're both really manifestations of the same thing.
Yeah. The slight nuance that I think is in the way you describe it as well, but let me just sort of sense check, is that I think opposites, though, are asymmetric. I think that, as it were, in the good and the bad,
I agree.
So, as it were, the good can contain the bad, but the bad would struggle to contain the good.
It's a point I make, indeed, in the matter with things. So, I mean, I'm, as you may have gathered, a great fan of asymmetry. And the problem is that we automatically assume that if there are two things that are complementary, they must be of equal value, but not necessarily. And in fact, I would say hardly ever, if ever.
Yeah, I thought that was so. And again, I mean, I always hesitate to talk about suffering and darkness and so on, because suffering is suffering, and it's be a bit of be careful what you pray for. But I think that there's real hope in this, though, too, that life can be said yes to, and when you have this understanding, because partly because it is dynamic, it is always moving and going somewhere. but partly because there is always a sort of pressure towards the good and towards the spiral, for all that things can clearly go very wrong as well. So I hold on to that a lot. But maybe I could just segue into another area I just wanted to raise with you and see what you think about this, because we're thinking a lot about AI at the moment, large language models, and the way that's shaping life, and then the speculation about how it will shape life for good or ill. And I wonder whether Blake, but I'm sure Blake can help us with this, but in this particular way, whether this makes sense to you. It's the difference he draws between memory and inspiration. I think memory for him is when you live this circumscribed life, drawing on what you've sort of gleaned, grasped, possessed, understood, and that's valuable. But it's inclined to close that life down again. It's inclined to foster what he called the same dull round. Memory then is linked to the sense that the cosmos is as many wheels, sort of just turning in a kind of cause and effect sort of way. Whereas inspiration, for Blake, is this openness, this porousness, like you were talking about. It's the presence that enables you to be in an open, receptive mode. And so life, therefore, has this potential always to move into the new, into the amplified, into the creative. And I think that this is part of the difference which we're sensing with AI, that on the one hand, it is very remarkable, and there's absolutely no doubt about it. But it can become dazzling. It can misenchant us. And maybe one way of understanding it is to realize that the AI draws on this extraordinary wealth of data, which might be called memory. And so it can do, good things, but always to remember that memory turns in on itself, it closes down. And so becoming alert to how we as human beings, through these things that differentiate us from the machine, that we comprehend, that we have intention, that we can pay different qualities of attention, as you've so much written about. This is the path to inspiration. And so I kind of hope that Blake can help us, again, not sort of just reject to core the kind of AI and so on in a kind of fear, but to understand how it does one thing, but we can do a whole lot more besides. And particularly thinking about inspiration might be a way of doing that.
I think that's very interesting. And what I'm thinking of there is a different way of thinking of memory. And I'd make a distinction between memory and a data bank. And what computers and AI draw on is banks of data. And what we do is have memory, which is a very remarkable thing, actually. It means that, in a way, experience can be revisited, not just information can be gathered. And that's not open to AI because, as far as we can know, it is not conscious. It simulates what a conscious being might say or do. But it doesn't have good memory. Indeed, it often does what people who have problems with memory do, which is to confabulate. They're called hallucinations, but they shouldn't be called hallucinations, because hallucinations are percepts without a cause for the perception. But confabulation is making up something that looks to you as though it would fit in this picture. And that's what AI does all the time. It fills in the gaps with its own inventions, which is extraordinarily dangerous. And so I'm a bit more of a pessimist than you are about AI. And I think that just because of the extraordinary dangers that it will pose to us in every walk of life, to social life, to education, to the law, to the whole way we think, and whether or not we're trained to think. So I'm in favor of foregoing the benefits, in inverted commas, that AI might bring us because of the dangers that it almost certainly will bring with it. But there is a distinction there, I think, to be made between there is a kind of memory that is rich and good, and there's a kind of memory which is a representation at a disembodied level, which is something else altogether. So yes, I mean, that is one of the differences, is that we do have memories, and we can revivify them. They can. I know what you mean when you say it can be a way of closing things down, because we get locked into a stale representation of the past, which is a typical left hemisphere mode, a stale representation that has none of the richness of the lived experience. But it can also prompt us, memories can prompt us to inspiration, can give us inspiration for new things.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important qualifier, actually. Which my inner Plato is saying, of course, because there's this word that there's no doubt on your mind as well, anamnesis, which is the return to something to make it present once more. And of course, the manner in which that's done is so important. The theological is never far from the conversation, but I mean, it's what a ritual does, is that the ritual that repeats at one level, but it repeats constantly to draw back the source. And so the way that maybe this is another way of making that distinction that you're talking about, is the manner in which we inhabit our memories really matters. And that's often a ritual embodied kind of practice, in order that memory and inspiration can then come together. Actually, perhaps that would be a way of putting it. That the memory becomes re-inspiring. It breathes something fresh into us.
Yes, I love that. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of ritual, but it is absolutely right. And we need something like that, actually, which is structured enough to summon whatever it is, but also loose enough to allow it to live, not to be pinned down and utterly specified. That's why a ritual has to remain implicit. And once it's made explicit, like just about everything that has human meaning, once the implicit is made explicit, a lot of that is lost. Which is why I find it interesting that at the time of a great sort of upsurge of left hemisphere thinking, which I associate with the Reformation, there was a lot of technical dispute about what was meant by a very important ritual of the body and blood of Christ.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's a bit like the devotion of the Sacred Heart in the Catholic tradition, that really takes off in the sort of 16th, 17th century, because of an anxiety that if we're isolated, how does God get in us? And Luther worried about the same thing with taking in the communion. And so, the kind of, particularly the Southern Catholic response was the body gets opened up, and you see the Sacred Heart, this sort of dramatic response to that sense of anxiety about participation. So look, maybe just wanted to we are having a bit of a spiral conversation, which is good, because I wanted to also just touch on Blake and science, which is something that you spend a lot of time to being nuanced about, and I think this is true in Blake too. That Blake, he can have a good go at Bacon, Newton, and Locke, his sort of triumvirate. But at the end of his great poem, Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion, he sees in the apotheosis Bacon, Newton, and Locke holding hands with Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare. So it's not about trying to cut off some part of our activity, but to give it its proper place. And I think this is what Blake was onto. And it's very fascinating, because I think time has shown him right, that what you will know a lot more about than me, but Whitehead's notion of misplaced concreteness, I think that's what Blake was really getting onto. And it relates back to your comment earlier about how, generalizations are all very well, but when you start mistaking the generalization for reality itself, that's when things start to come unstuck. And of course, there's a great temptation to do that, because in a technological frame, which is where nature has been repurposed for under the auspices of the human will, if you like. Generalizations give us great power, and they're very seductive. Again, there's a sort of misenchantment going on. But I think Blake can help us sort of push back against that, and not by becoming anti-science, which would be slightly ridiculous, but by
Yes.
what many scientists have said continually. I mean, a go-to person for me here is Werner Heisenberg, one of the great
Yes. Oh
early
gosh. Yes.
quantum theorists. And in a lovely little book called Physics and Philosophy, he at the end there says
Yes.
that we need to hold particularly onto language. And he even rehearses particular words like mind, like soul, like God, because he says language is where we make contact with reality. And so therefore science needs to be listening to language, not in a sort of mathematical generalization, pretending that it's replacing language.
Yes.
So it comes
Yes.
from the sort of highest
Absolutely.
authorities, this resistance
Well, that's
to,
right.
yeah. Anyway, so
It's
I've said quite a lot, but you've thought all about misplaced concreteness, I know.
yes. Yes. I mean, it's of interest, by the way, that a study of the religious affiliations and beliefs of Nobel Prize winners shows that the group that have the greatest history of a kind of theism are physicists. They absolutely, 96% of them had some sort of belief in a God. Well, not just some sort, but a belief in God. Whereas those who won Nobel Prizes for literature, perhaps only 65% did. So it's a complete mistake to think that scientists, clever scientists, don't have any room in their world for God. And it reminds me of something that John Stuart Mill said, although he was anticipated about 100 years earlier by Leibniz, that when people disagree on a matter, it's more often that they are mistaken not in what they assert, but in what they deny. And so I think applying that to Blake and science, I think Blake would want to affirm what science is able to tell us, but to push back against science's quite unnecessary addition to this. And that's all that there is. Which is unscientific in itself. It's a dogma. There is no basis for that in science. Science starts from certain beliefs that it will limit itself to observing certain things and measuring certain things, and that's fine. It's very useful to do that. But you can't, at the end of the process, say, "But there isn't anything else. That all the things that we deliberately cut out don't exist." So that's one point, and I think the other is that. So I love this idea of the trio Bacon and
Newton and Locke. Yeah.
Human Locke. Thank you, Bacon
Yeah.
and Human Locke holding hands with Chaucer, etc. It is wonderful because I think in a way poets are open to the wonder of science, generally speaking, but scientists need to be persuaded somehow that the arts are another way of reaching reality that is as powerful or more powerful than science. Science can tell us some very specific things, but there's much that it can't deal with, and that much is often the realm that is most important to us.
Yeah, and relatedly, in the book I discuss how, because Blake, I think, was a kind of scientist. I think if you'd gone into his, I mean, it's avant la lettre because, of course, it's a Victorian word, but nonetheless, if you'd gone into his workshop, it would have,
Yes.
I think, been more like a chemistry lab than a modern artist studio, because it would have been full of like metal plates and acids, and there'd been an acrid smell in the air and all that. I think the point, but the point is, I think he knew his materials as kind of personalities. They had, the different things he was working with, and he was a great experimenter with different materials. He had to get to know them, their character, their quality, their soul. And the artist, I think, can bring that memory to science as well. That you have to get to know imaginatively that which you're working with, that which you're studying. I also in the book reference a friend of mine, actually, Pauline Rudd, and she is a biochemist, and in particular she works on proteins and cells. And she's written about this publicly now as well, but she says that all her life she's realized that a key part of her science is getting to know the character of these proteins. What are they likely to do? Um, I saw them behave in this way, and I wonder what would happen if we kind of approached each other in a different way. And that is and what's really important about that is that it's different from using AI to kind of like do a massive number crunch and produce, no doubt, tremendous predictions and so on, and which can be of use. But what you then need is the human comprehending, imaginative encounter, because that produces insight. And this is the difference that she makes, the difference between sort of a prediction and insight. And she feels that thinking of the whole, well, I'm slightly glossing what she said now, but thinking of the whole of reality as kind of like a personal encounter, rather than a sort of predictive sort of estimate, is going to be really important actually for the advance of science. And again, she's not the only one here. There's a Michael Attila, who was the head of the Royal Society. He made this very big speech at the turn of the millennium when he said that science is faced with a kind of Faustian pact, that he talked particularly about algebra, but he could have been talking about algorithms. They'll give you this tremendous power, but at the great price that you lose your soul. And by that, I think he meant losing this felt connected sense of vitality with things, which isn't just an optional extra nice to have, but actually is part and parcel of the methods of science.
Absolutely wonderful, and absolutely what I also believe, that imagination, in other words, or the soul, the ability to not just put things together, but actually to see a new whole there, alive, is a very important part of science, and it's testified to by the stories of many, if not all, the ones that we know of stories of great scientific breakthroughs, great mathematical breakthroughs. They were made by a sort of intuitive insight based on shapes of things that could be seen as individuals. And what particularly strikes me about Pauline Rudd's insight is that, which I didn't know about, it eliminates the difference between something I'm constantly banging on about, but the difference between making a distinction and making a division. So it's terribly important to distinguish certain things without seeing them as divided from everything else. And so the process whereby chemistry complexifies itself into individuals, and what she's really saying is these proteins behave like individuals, but of course they all obey the general laws, as it were, that we deduce that the chemicals follow. And so it's not that they go off atomistically somewhere. They collaborate, and they collaborate powerfully because they have a different essence. So you have all these, the process of creation, it seems to me, is constantly one of diversifying what is unified, and not fragmenting it by doing so, but just showing that there are distinctions that are rich. And then taking those distinctions again, having been made into a higher union, ready for further distinctions to be made. So there's this constant going apart and coming together. Two contraries that I think that are embodied in Blake's work, where he is constantly pointing to this need to see distinctions but not to sunder. What do you think?
I completely agree. I mean, the phrase that comes to mind is another well-known phrase of his, that opposition is true friendship. And what it's often the stress in that phrase is often said that, the kind of antagonism of friendship can make for more, and that is true. But the important thing too is that he's not saying opposition is true enmity, but opposition is true friendship. That there's distinction without division, precisely as you're saying, and that then is good for all concerned. Yeah,
and leads to growth. Without contraries, there can be no progression. So, yes, I mean he in a way was anticipating Hegel. but but my word, he's more palatable than Hegel in his way of expressing it, and more gifted in an imaginative insight. But there we are. Yes.
Well, thanks so much for your time and welcoming the book and as we're basically saying, along with everything else, I really hope that these key phrases of Blake, the less known phrases, then the poetry and the imagery can really help people feel these things that we're talking about, and so feel the welcome of a different consciousness of life and so on, imaginatively to engage with it. That's very much part of my aim with the book.
And I'm
It
sure,
really
I'm sure from everything I know of you, not just on what you have had to say about Blake, but your book on Dante did the same thing, that you really opened Dante to people in a way that I don't know any other book has done. So those are two very great figures that you are helping to illuminate, and I really hope and wish for you that loads of people buy your book and read it and take it to heart, because I think there'll be so much to learn. And I know it won't be a difficult thing to do to read it. It will be a pleasure to read, because that's how you are. So let's go for it. And I wish you all success.
Hey, well, thank you so much for those thoughts, and it's our shared project. So hooray to that! Yes, thank you.